glad to have you join us once again on the program. I am Folashade Ogurinde. The Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, has released guidelines for the newly introduced electronic invoicing and evaluator for exporters and importers. The new regulation, the CBN explained, is aimed at determining the accurate value of goods leaving the country. The Apex Bank said the electronic process, which replaces the hard copy, must be authenticated by the authorized dealer banks. The CBN further explained that all imports and exports with unit prices that are more than 2.5% of the verified global checkmate prices would be queried and would not be allowed for successful completion. Well, joining me now to discuss this further and its possible impact on importers, Kalu Aja, economist and financial expert, joins me on the program. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, before we go into the pros and cons of this policy, can you tell us what this new policy is all about?
Hi, Palashadi. Thank you for inviting me. So let me try to break it down so we can follow. It's a policy that has lots of connected parts. Very simply, the CBN is going to now base imports and exports on a quote-unquote benchmark price. So let me give you an example so that we follow, and then I can explain the policy. Let's assume I want to buy a BMW car from Atlanta. What will happen now is that I will go to BMW of Atlanta, and BMW of Atlanta will give me an invoice. Then BMW would then register on an app or a database that CBN will provide. And on that database, BMW of Atlanta will put their price in there, how much they want to sell to me, right? I will then take that invoice, register BMW, give them a digital certificate so that they will authenticate my invoice. That's one part of it. The price I am going to put on my invoice cannot be below or above 2.5% of the CBN benchmark price. So it means whatever BMW of Atlanta gives to me cannot go above or beyond that band. If it's above or beyond that band, the policy states that CBN will not honor the Form M that would enable me to pay BMW to import my car to Nigeria. The same thing with exports. If I'm exporting to, say, China and I want to export cocoa to China, the same thing, I am now the supplier. I will quote to China a price that is not going to be below or above 2.5% of the benchmark price for cocoa as referenced on the CBN database. So everything revolves now around this database benchmark price. And the cap is going to be 2.5% on exports, on imports. So in a way, price control, in a way, making sure that it's going to be a uniform pricing for imports and exports, allowing CBN to track imports and exports. But it does bring in some complications, I'm sure we will talk about as we go along.
So let's take the manufacturing sector now as a sample in this case. How will this policy affect the sector?
Okay, so let's assume the policy works. Let's assume it works. And if you want to import machinery, equipment, you'd have to go to that benchmark price. Let's assume everything works and quote unquote, the international suppliers agree to pay $350 a year to register and adhere to it. Then the positive is that the suppliers know if I want to import anything, I can just go to that database and I know it's going to be 2.5% of the price of the average price that I'm seeing. So I can more or less plan. CBN can plan. That's the good side. That's the way CBN is looking at that. You can plan your imports. Perhaps you can cap the imported inflation of those foreign goods by capping the price at 2.5%. You can also clean up the database so you can remove the bad actors that are not really importing, but just maybe putting up invoices and Form Ms to get access to Forex. So the good part is that might reduce the demand for Forex. That might increase planning, that improve planning, that might allow the manufacturers to have a hold on their prices to then pass through less price increases to the Nigerian domestic consumers who are going to be in Naira. So you import in dollars, you can cap that dollar price increase so that way, when you are passing those prices along to your consumers, you are capping it. That's the good part. The bad part is that what if it doesn't work? What if the suppliers say, well, my product has a special feature here, so it can't be 2.5% of the CBN benchmark price. Perhaps mine has this variant or this addition. So then who determines what is the price, the real benchmark price? Why are we paying $250 annually? Is that not going to be an increase in the cost to manufacturers? Because even though the act says the point supplier will pay, we all know in reality it's going to be the Nigerian importer that would really pay that duty.
Now, the Director General of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, MAN, in response to this new policy, has asked the question. He says, what happens if some companies are able to negotiate better prices due to their scale of order? Or are they to get some competitive lower prices? Would these prices be within the benchmark? I would like to get your response to this, please.
Yeah, that's a question I asked. I asked a lot of people, and I really couldn't get a specific answer. It makes sense if you say the benchmark price is $10,000 because the policy starts at 10,000. So if it's below 10,000, this does not apply to you. But what if I want to import something I can get a cheaper price? Do I then have to make sure it's within 2.5 because am I not saving Nigeria dollars? I couldn't get an answer to that. The reality is that the circular is very, very clear that it has to be 2.5%. But it does make sense that if I can get a cheaper price, or if I have a long-term agreement with the supplier to supply me goods and get a bunch of a discount, and that discount is not going to be available to other Nigerian importers, will the CBN reject my Form M? By the circular alone, the CBN says it will. But I presume that in operation, maybe they might tweak it around. I don't see why they would ask you to pay a higher price and get more forex from the CBN to fund that import if you get a lower price. So that's what I think will happen. We haven't talked about exports, Olushade. I think that part, I need to talk about it if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So now, if you reverse it now to exports, right? What has been happening in Nigeria is that Nigerian exporters, let's take cocoa. There's a benchmark price for cocoa international from the Chicago Commodities Exchange Board. So you go online, you see how much cocoa is sold for. I understand that what Nigerian exporters do is that they would offer a discount on that price to attract buyers to Nigerian cocoa. So buyers will come to Nigeria, buy cocoa at a discounted price. Why do they do this? Because of the differential between the official dollar rate and the quote-unquote black market rate. So I can take a discount on my cocoa export price because if I get paid in dollars, I don't repatriate that to the CBN. I rather take my dollars and I sell it on the alternative markets, the black market, the parallel markets, and I get a much, much higher rate than the NAFEX rate. So I'm able to cover the losses on my discounted cocoa price and make it on the currency market. So the long-term effect is that in Nigeria, the CBN is seeing less inflow of forex from official exports, right? And is seeing that money going to the parallel market. So with this, they are basically saying you have to sell cocoa at the benchmark price, which means Nigeria will then get more revenues because there's no more discount on the sell side. And then, of course, you can then have you can take the NAFEX rate and compensate for the loss you would make, quote unquote, from that discounted price. So they're like flipping it around. This might favor again the exporters and might not favor the importers. It's a very complicated and interlocked process in a way. I mean, I agree with the man asking the CBN. I would say take it slower and do a pilot first. Pick one commodity, even if it's cars, and then implement this policy and see what happens. To put the entire imports, even if it's a good policy, implementation is always going to be a problem. To change something as massive as Nigerian import and export, it has a lot of connecting parts, forex reserves, competition in Africa. What it means is that Ghana's cocoa, what if Ghana depreciates the price of their cocoa and Nigeria's benchmark price is still going to be higher? So I agree with Man, it should be slower and we should do a pilot first. 3 to 6 months down the line, I think we'll still be in the teething stage of this new policy. I don't think we would have gotten it right, even if it's a perfect policy. It's a lot of parts with foreign buyers What if they say they're not going to pay 350? What if they say we're not going to pay? Well, we are going to pay. So this is the thing. I think we should take it slower, do a pilot, and I think 3 to 6 months from now, we'll still be in the teething introductory stage of this policy, and we'll not be able to actually see if this has worked or not worked.
Now, do you see this policy improving the economy in the long and short term?
Well, this policy was done, I think, in Ghana. When I spoke to someone, I said this policy was done in Ghana, the import side, and that Ghana revised it, and it's in the process of revising it again. So it's a very, very difficult thing to do. CBN is looking at, if this policy works, CBN can know exactly how much forex it needs, say 3 months or 6 months ahead of time. That allows CBN to plan. That allows CBN to even fund their imports. So it's a good policy if it works. If it does not work, for instance, look at the question you asked me, there's going to be bureaucracy, there's going to be an added cost to imports, right? And it's going to be who's going to address the bureaucracy. This is my fear, that you might tie this up in bureaucracy and you lose the positive effects you're going to get from the planning advantage that you'll get. This is advisory to Nigerian customs. Remember, this is a CBN policy, and it's only going to work in quote because the Nigerian banks are funding from EMS. This does not apply to the 44 banned items. And CBN themselves have said this is advisory to customs. So this means that if customs say this is just going to be a hassle, we're not going to enforce it, then who knows? So it's good. If it works, it's going to be very good for the CBN in terms of planning. But I see it's too soon in my take. It's February the 1st. It's too soon and it's too sweeping. They should have started from just one commodity and then see how it runs before they then expand. Do a pilot first. That's what I would expect them to have done.
In terms of value now, do you see this policy helping to strengthen the Naira?
The thing is this, right? This is the irony. Because Nigeria does exports, we export a lot of crude oil, right? And that's where we get most of our forex from, and the forex funds our budget. Nigeria actually needs a weaker currency because when we export with a weaker Naira, we get more, with a weaker Naira, we get more value from the exports of crude oil because we can convert the dollar to Naira and pay local bills. The problem with the weak Naira is that then imports are expensive. And those imports of, say, food get translated back to Nigerian consumer. So overall, I think the problem is really not the weak Naira or the strong Naira, but I think the stability of the Naira. People want to be able to plan long-term with a currency, and people want to be able to basically get currency if they want it. If Naira is 1,000 Naira to $1, and you know that's going to be the value, and you can plan with that, and it's going to be available, then the productive base in Nigeria, it's also, you have power that you can manufacture. People may not really mind. The problem is when it's 550 to a Naira to $1, that makes imports cheaper than local production. That's the problem. So we should have a weak Naira. But if you can't produce locally because costs are too high, then imports simply become cheaper. So you see, you have two policies banging against each other, and that's the problem. So I don't think Nigeria needs a strong currency. It's a misnomer in some ways. If you are exporting, you want a weaker currency, but you must see this and add that you have to have local production that is cheaper than imports. For now, imports are cheaper than local production.
Well, Kalu Aja, economist and financial expert, thank you very much for your contribution. Well, we'll take a break and return shortly. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Federal government's decision to stall the full implementation of the Petroleum Industry Act (PIA) by 18 months has been met with mixed reactions. However, the federal government explained that the decision is to ensure that all the necessary structures are put in place to cushion the impact of the removal on citizens. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation (NNPC) Limited had revealed that Nigeria consumes about 19,535 billion liters of petrol yearly, with about 241 naira now paid on every liter on subsidy. This brings yearly subsidy to about 4.6 trillion naira. To this end, the NNPC has requested a total of 3 trillion naira from the federal government to fund fuel subsidy in 2022. Joining me now to discuss this further is the CEO and Managing Director of Kauri Assets Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, what are the consequences of FG's decision to suspend the implementation of the Petroleum Industry Act, the PIA?
Okay, thank you for having me. I think the first thing we have to recognize is that the Petroleum Industry Act was to provide some clarity in terms of the fiscal framework that govern the petroleum industry in the country. With the suspension of the Petroleum Industry Act, which means that the act will go for an amendment that will make it to become live from 18 months from now, what that means that the instant regulation that we are implemented or we are instituted by the act will now some of them will be kept in abeyance. I don't know I don't have the details of the level of amendment that the federal government wants to do. It could just be that they want to suspend some of those acts, some sections of the act till the future, because some section of the act has already been implemented. We already have NNPC incorporated as a limited liability company. We already have Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission. We already have the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Regulatory Authority. So those ones have been implemented. We have already scrapped DPR. We have scrapped PEF. We've scrapped some other agencies related to in the oil and gas sector and consolidated them into one or two other entities. So some components of the Petroleum Industry Act have been implemented, and I don't think the government has any intention of reversing that. So probably what they want to suspend or want to excise from that act is the portion that relates to subsidy. But if you take out this issue of subsidy or suspend subsidy, the country's fiscal framework of fiscal situation will worsen as it were, because the government will now have to cough out resources beyond what it had projected to cough out to meet subsidy payment. That also means that any expected investment in the downstream, particularly in local refineries beyond the refinery being set up in export free trade zone, may not materialize. So in terms of the structure or the downstream sector of the oil and gas sector, it will remain as it is until those components of the petroleum industry are activated.
Now, how much of an impact will this have on the economy and the oil and gas sector?
I think the impact on the economy is very clear. I had mentioned earlier that the government, the fiscal authorities, will have continued to bear the burden of subsidy, which means revenues agreeable to the 3 tiers of government will continue to be eroded or diminished by the amount of subsidy to be paid. As it is today, the Minister of Finance said that the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, Nigerian NNPC Limited, has come up with a bill of about 3 trillion naira subsidy payment. That 3 trillion naira is an amount that would have accrued to the Federation account that would have been shared to 3 tiers of government. What that means is that the amount that would have been available for infrastructure development, for investment in critical social facilities, such as healthcare, education, will be expended on subsidy payment. And the 3 tiers of government will struggle, be hard pressed to meet their budgetary obligations as a result of part of their money going into subsidy. In terms of the industry itself, I had mentioned earlier that any investment that anybody is expecting in the downstream sector, particularly in the refinery sector, will be put on hold until there is clarity in terms of the subsidy payment issues. So you're going to see an arrested development in the refining sector of the Nigerian economy, and they're also going to see a shortfall in revenues agreeable to the government, which will stymie or constrain investment in critical sectors of the economy. So I think you're going to see a slowdown in capital expenditure and obviously see an increase in borrowing by the tiers of government in order to meet the obligations.
Now, in its defense, government has explained that it would not make any sense to pull out subsidy when inflation is still on the high side. Will this make any difference since there are economic implications for subsidy in the first place?
Well, the issue of government excuse that it will not implement removal of subsidy because of inflation is that Nigeria has lived with a high inflation rate for the past couple of years. We're not likely going to see a single-digit inflation in the next couple of years. in the immediate future. So if that becomes a parameter, the key parameter for determining when the subsidy is to be removed, then we are in for the long haul. Again, I think the preparation that we made earlier, prior to the reversal of inflation in December, we are made even when inflation rate was much higher than it is today. I mean, the Minister of Finance had made provisions for palliatives and had come up with a very elaborate plan on how to cushion the impact of removing the subsidy. So I thought that when those plans were being made, they took cognizance of the inflationary situation. But in any case, if we have to, like I said, if we have to use inflation as an excuse on taking out the subsidy, then we should be ready to keep the subsidy for the next 10 years.
Well, Mr. Johnson Chuku, CEO and Managing Director of Cowrie Assets Management Limited, thank you very much for your time. And it's a wrap on the program. See you again next time. Bye for now.